Hi everyone, I think we're live at the moment. Thank you for being here with us again for another reading in the Hizmet Reads section. Of course, we're continuing with the same book, and we're very fortunate to have Professor Paul Weller here with us again. Now we're going on to our fourth chapter called Islamic Spirituality and Social Processing. Paul, welcome once again.
Thank you.
And I'm going to start with the first question from the title of the chapter, actually. What is social processing? Yeah. I mean, the Islamic spirituality is something we can have a bit of a guess at, but what is social processing?
Okay, well, I'll answer that, I guess, by the intention behind the chapter title. I think often when people in general encounter Hizmet as a movement or its various manifestations in different organizational forms, what they often encounter are initiatives that engage with the social in one way or another. I mean, most obviously through education, but also through dialogue initiatives, poverty initiatives, and so on. It's not so often that those who encounter Hizmet encounter in a direct or explicit or obvious sense the spirituality that informs the practice of Hizmet. And I mean, in a way, that's a good thing, because that means that those who are participating in Hizmet are not going around and saying, oh, look how observant a Muslim I am, in a way that's full of kind of pride and so on. On the other hand, it does mean that it's possible for kind of outside observers of Hizmet, or people who hear about Hizmet or encounter it in action, to overlook or not appreciate enough the roots of where these social engagements come from. It's only perhaps when people get to know individuals more, and or if they take that step, to look into or read or listen to the teaching of Fethullah Gülen, that they then begin to understand and appreciate Hizmet not merely as what one might call a sociological phenomenon, but as an expression of a particular religio-spiritual trajectory. Now, I use the word processing in particular in the title to kind of emphasize the dynamic nature of that. That to some extent, there's a balance intended in this title between a sense that spirituality is something that is rooted, that isn't the same as religion, because religious forms are subject to a lot of change, adaptation, and development. But arguably, the spirituality that can inform religious forms is something that is or should or could be more stable. How that works itself out in terms of social engagement is necessarily something that doesn't happen straightforwardly overnight or in a direct line. And therefore there's a process involved. So social processing, as that spirituality engages with different social contexts, different questions and issues come to light and need to be worked through. There's no, let's say, straightforward, straight line from Islamic spirituality to how that's manifested in terms of social engagement. So I think that at least is my kind of thinking behind why those two terms are both in the heading of this chapter title, and also in a sense, as I mentioned last week, the chapters within the book have a particular place within the book, because the book is kind of arguing on a trajectory of its own. And it's this interface between what I'm calling here Islamic spirituality and social processing that I think certainly lie, in a way, at the heart of the book and what the book's trying to say about the translation, the hermeneutics of what it is that Gülen is trying to point to, and the ways in which people who are inspired or shaped or challenged by that seek to put those things into some kind of practice.
I mean, I'm assuming that it's kind of coming from a non-Muslim majority kind of reflection on encounters with Hizmet in that sense, because
yes, it is, yeah, and that's yeah.
So primarily through the education or dialogue activities that the Hizmet movement does.
What you've just said there, of course, raises an interesting question about the perception, of course, of other Muslims in relation to Hizmet. That's something I don't particularly explore in this book. I do a little bit in the companion book on Hizmet in Europe, and the degree to which, or otherwise, Hizmet actively seeks to engage or steers away from engagement with Muslim groups, and or how they perceive Hizmet. So you're right. This is from a more, I guess, in that sense, generic perspective in terms of how societies, and I'm here, I guess that also reflects and betrays my own social context rather than, say, a Muslim majority society.
A Western context, I guess, primarily. Because I mean, and then the chapter title was interesting itself, and then I think the subtitles within the chapter get fascinating and sound quite attractive and alluring as the chapter continues. Especially the first one. So we go to Muslim security, heroic tradition, and alternative hermeneutics. So, I mean, what are these insecurities that Muslims are experiencing? Is there a result? I mean, resort to heroism? Is it does it play there? Is it present in Gülen's discourse? If yes, how? And then if no, is it different, or has there been a shift in Gülen's perception and discourse as well?
Yeah. I mean, Muslim insecurity, I think, sometimes that which one says loudest can betray that which one is most worried about. And hence, in the opening section of this book, kind of cite, in a sense, the crowds of, let's say, Muslims on the streets who shout loudly, "God is great," but are perhaps by the loudness of that kind of shouting betraying precisely, in a way, their lack of faith in the overarching purposes of the divine to be worked out in human history. And it more often is saying we feel ourselves to be very small, weak, and overcome. And I mean, there is a sense in which, for inevitable reasons, and we've touched on this in earlier weeks, historically, the development of colonialism, imperialism, its impact on Muslim majority societies, the alignment in the modern world of kind of scientific and technological advance with quotes unquotes Western, not Muslim civilization, whereas historically one could look further back and say, well, it was clear that when Europe was in the quotes dark ages, Islamic civilizations were flourishing in arts and science and so on. But in this present setting, which still has a lot that is determined by what occurred in the 19th century and the early 20th centuries going into the middle of that century. This reactive sense of having lost the sense of civilizationally having lost something, standing, a position, a self-belief even in many ways, in an appropriate way. So what is an appropriate confidence in Islam, which I think is something that Fethullah Gülen would wish to engender, but the difference between that and, well, A, confidence in Muslims, and B, a confidence that might come over either as an arrogance or as a denial of the positions, rights, perspectives, feelings of others. So I think that's a bit what I'm trying to say about insecurity. And I think the heroic, what I call the heroic tradition, I mean, one can see and understand that's had a thread in Islamic history, and for reasons of, in that sense, different periods, civilizational victory, that's something that can't just be kind of jumped over. But I think, as one or two of the interviewees point out in discussion around that in this chapter, one of the difficulties is many of the early histories were written with a view to emphasizing, for example, the military achievements, almost to the negligence of other aspects, and that in itself then further developed a kind of a narrative that focused, who and what is the good Muslim on, and of course this also has gender politics wrapped up in it, because it's very often the male Muslim who is in view here in this kind of narrative of the heroic, this particular version of the heroic, and that's around there in the history and the tradition with a small t, and as a consequence, when groups are looking around for something that can inspire confidence again in a world in which one feels insecure, those aspects of that tradition are seen that they might become resources that one could build upon and use positively. Now, I think you posed the question, could one see anything of that also in Gülen, and or were there developments? I think one can see aspects of that. So in his earlier work, I think perhaps the book, I've just forgotten the exact title, Muhammad Commander and something, I've just forgotten the other part to that title. There is quite a strong thing around that. And also, of course, in some of the work where he is clearly conscious that Western countries and non-Muslim peoples do not have sufficient understanding or respect of, for example, the richness of Islamic civilizations, and in particular, in that sense, the positive aspects of the Ottoman heritage, And one can see in certain appeals to to people's structures, processes in that era, something of that. But I think what starts to shift is what I'm here calling this alternative hermeneutics. So hermeneutics being a word to describe, by what we understand or interpret things. And of course, when one comes to the Quran or the Hadith, or indeed Sharia or any aspect of anything, one doesn't come to it as a blank person. One comes to it with questions, issues, biographies, contexts. And I think one of the interesting things about Fethullah Gülen is what I do try to explore in this book a little bit, is the interplay between context, biography, what is then brought to the Quran and Islamic tradition in terms of hermeneutical keys, out of what has been a developmental process. Now, I would argue there's always a strong interplay between what one might call, in the broadest sense of the term, and it's not such a common term in Islamic tradition, or it means something very specific there, theology and biography. I think that's always there, but it's not always so explicitly there or explicitly worked with. And I think it's quite interesting. And I think it's Ahmed Kurukan who in the chapter points out, and I think rightly so, that probably through the encounter, the first encounters for Gülen himself, of Islam being practiced in non-Muslim majority contexts, and early on that would have been from his early visits to a number of European countries, Germany and the Netherlands in particular, that this sets in train another way of thinking about, another way of posing questions to and learning from and interpreting what is received, than if one lives solely in a Muslim majority context, albeit one that was in his life not the same as the one into which he was born, but was more complex through his encounters in other parts of Turkey and with other people groups in Turkey than those of pious Muslims. But nevertheless, still predominantly the dominant cultural registers, the things that are don't need to be explained almost, or things which are not challenged because they're just part of how things are. That's not the case when you find yourself as a practicing Muslim in Western societies, or indeed if you find yourself as a practicing Christian in a Muslim majority society, or you find, because the minority position nearly always opens up the question of, well, what here is cultural and time bound, and what might not be, and how do we distinguish between these things? And I think you can see that coming through trajectory of development in Gülen's writings in a way that I think has been influenced by by those encounters. Of course, now living in the USA, it's par excellence so, at least in one sense, albeit one might also see Sailorsburg as a bit of an island in another way, but in principle. So yeah, I guess that's what I'm trying to, in this first section, look at in different ways. This starting point of this sense of insecurity that I would suggest can be seen in the majority Muslim world and among many Muslims. Where can one then find something that allows one to be rooted and not apologetic for being, in the wrong sense of the word, for being Muslim, and to be confident even in a way that, is not a confidence that either tries to hark back to or is informed by this heroic tradition, but is a confidence which, in a sense, all people of faith and belief need to find a way to find in an increasingly pluralizing world. Because if one doesn't find a way to be with integrity what one is in such a world, then some of the things that can occur are very clearly, and again in the chapter I think I cite Gülen as sort of saying what can happen when one can't find a way of living with integrity and confidence, but in a different kind of way, in the kind of way that then I go on to explore in the chapter under the next section, which is about putting what's the title of the next section? I've just lost it. Yeah, spirituality, the true human love and service. So it's about a shift of things in which the human and love become central to the hermeneutic of understanding what Islam might be about and of trying to apply that in practice. Yeah.
I mean, I was just thinking with the heroic dimension, is that something that you would say is perhaps tied to the generation that Hizmet is in at the moment? I mean, with second, third generations perhaps, who would now be migrant communities in the West, who will have a more kind of complex or rich perhaps identity, in which the national identity may not be as Turkey based, and it may not be linked to the kind of colonial legacies of being, in an inferior state. Although Turkey wasn't conditioned in coloniality, it was still a Middle Eastern country, and that is something that's, I guess, linked to Muslims indirectly through that. Is it something that would, be reduced?
I mean, there are, I think, generational differences there, but at the same time, of course, it is the case that because that it's quite possible for people who are not formed by that kind of shared history also to appeal to the heroic, because, for example, in reaction to their experience, which is very real in European societies, of discrimination, Islamophobia, these things exist, and of course part of what shaped certain kinds of Islamic movements or Islamist movements, something like Hizmet Reads or something, is rooted in, if you read the narratives of people who were shaped by that, or those who went through it and then took another pathway, this sense of as minority Muslims also in the West. So I think and therefore almost out of that, this looking for sources that can, if you like, reignite or give strength. And again, the kind of heroic can be something that's quite alluring in that way. So I don't think it's necessarily only a generational thing. So the question is, how people respond to and react to different things, and what resources they have to draw on. Yeah.
I mean, like you said, the kind of Islamophobia in Europe is very real. I mean, perhaps we just kind of went back to my own personal experience. Perhaps it's the degree in which you feel integrated into a society that could reduce that narrative. Post my own life experiences and that.
Yeah.
So on to the next chapter. No, next section of the chapter.
Yes. Not the next chapter. Next week.
You mentioned the kind of subtitle spirituality, the true human love and service. And this goes back really to Gülen's kind of early sermons as well, and some of the interviews that you mentioned that people find it as kind of one of the moving factors that in some cases kind of answer some existential questions or questioning that individuals may be going through. And it kind of makes Islam in the very sort of real sense a verb that can be lived, I guess. As all of his teachings are kind of focused on an element of embodying something and acting in society. So how does Gülen link the spiritual to then be kind of shaped through an active Hizmet? I mean, for Gülen, is it something that's purely religious, kind of theological? I mean, we know if we were to study it, there would be sociological elements and other things that we've discussed in previous weeks. But for Gülen, is it something that's purely theological and comes from that spiritual case?
Yes, I mean, I think Gülen certainly very much concentrates on that, possibly even to the exclusion of other factors in how he would articulate things. I think that's not the case in relation to people who work, in a sense, with these impulses in the very early, before one could even speak of Hizmet as a formation, rather than, in a sense, a collection of individuals who then formed networks that were kind of had shared overlapping things. But I think they, and certainly as Hizmet began to take particular organizational forms and initiatives, other considerations. So how does this more, if you like, exclusively religious impulse, how does it find embodiment? Where does it have opportunity within particular structures or conjunctions that occur in society in order for things to develop? Becomes something that is consciously thought about and worked on, both for kind of potentially for good and ill. So you could say, for example, that the particular some of the particular developments around education in Turkey occurred at a time when from the powers that be, there was a wish to kind of open up a more, with a small L word, kind of liberal social economic environment within which individual personal development along the lines of educational opportunity and so on was seen as keys and motors to economic and business growth and so on, in contrast to what had been previously maybe a very more heavily state dominated, controlled system of education. And you can see that Hizmet initiatives in education, in a sense, consciously took opportunity in those spaces that were created. But for Gülen himself, I'm not sure that he, as far as I can see it, or understand it, that he would say, oh, well, you know, there's, if you like, there's that opportunity space opening up, go and do something about it. Apart from on the very big scale. So that clearly happened, I think, with the end of the Soviet Union and the sense of, you know, go and help our brothers and sisters in formerly communist-dominated lands where we have cultural ties, religious shared history, etc. But beyond the go and do something, the specific what, I often have the sense that that's something which Gülen gives the challenge to the individuals or the groups themselves to work out what that very concrete what might be. So there might be this general directing towards opportunity for how to embody this core spirituality, but the specificity in each place and each time of how concretely to do that, I'm not sure is something that that he particularly gets into, so to speak. That's my reading of it. I may or may not be right about that, but yeah.
I was just wondering, in the interviews that you did, were there kind of key or kind of common perhaps factors or themes that were raised of motivators for people to begin participating in Hizmet, especially very early on? I mean, was it
Yeah, well, I think, you know, and I mean, I think in the previous chapter, to some extent, there were quite a number of interviews that obviously did indicate how important for people in that generation educational initiatives were, for a whole host of reasons, I think. Not least because certainly for those who themselves came from a more generally pious Muslim background, the opportunity to actually, although the schools had no explicit religious character, because under Turkish law that wasn't viable, nevertheless, it was clear, for example, who the teachers were, and they had a particular kind of example that they wanted to give, and that this. So for people who came from a pious Muslim background, I think opportunity was that, well, on the one hand, that's somewhere relatively safe that I can learn, and on the other hand, also for some groups, and you know, in due course, not right at the beginning, but significantly opening up some of those opportunities for girls and for young women in a way that might not have been there more broadly. Also under this sense of being a relatively safe environment in which certainly parents who might have anxieties, have had anxieties about girls in education might feel able to entrust in a sense. So those kind of things, I think one can see. I think the other thing that comes out of a number of the interview narratives where people look back on and talk about the educational thing is actually the personal questioning and questing. What does it mean to be me in this world, or to be, how can I make sense of this? How also in a society that's kind of moving rapidly in terms of science and technology, how can I, as a practicing Muslim, connect with all of that? Are there ways in which I can do that and draw on, So I think those kind of things, I think you can see in quite a number of stories, along with a kind of a socialization process, which is to do with the kind of networks formed around all of that, which go beyond the schools themselves into the families of those who are at school, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I just think on especially the topic of girls, and early on in Hizmet's kind of rooting in Turkey. I mean, the fact that there were boarding schools where girls could stay if they were going to go to university in the city and they'd come from a village or a rural town. Things so kind of socioeconomic perhaps anxieties that families may have of their child going on to study university in a city. So there is that sort of, as you mentioned, variety of factors present. On the topic of for freedom, the next kind of subtitle in the book, you talk about Gülen's being an advocate for freedom. Is his definition of freedom one which stems from a religious understanding, or is it kind of placed within the human rights discourse? And then are there any kind of problems which would stem from this later on?
I think, well, there's several things to say about this. I mean, one, in this chapter, I quote really quite extensive passages from the interview with Gülen, partly because I didn't want just to try and summarize some of that and get the emphasis or nuances wrong. I mean, to me, it's clear that, again, there are developments and trajectories here. So I think historically, in relation to the freedom of others than, say, practicing Muslims, Gülen historically would have talked much more about tolerance than about freedom, and would have alluded to, again, historical examples of that in comparative terms, although things were not ideal in the Ottoman Empire by any means for those who were religious minorities. As compared with many state formations in the world and many other historical experiences, there were things that could be positively said about that. And also tolerance and here we come to things like language, which is difficult in terms of transfer of meaning. Tolerance as an English word is a rather weak word. In some ways, it implies almost putting up with. I tolerate something. One use of that word can be, well, I really don't like that, but I'll tolerate it if I have to. Now, of course, the word that's often translated into English intolerance is the Turkish word hoşgörü, which is of a different set of meanings. It's a much more positive, bracing, warm word. So here we get into one of those difficulties in any case, which I'm always hyper conscious of, particularly in relation to this book where I'm trying to interpret Gülen and not just Hizmet's groups and movements which might speak German, French, English, or any other language that I have full, a lot more knowledge of than Turkish. So, so part of the issue is around that, but I think one can discern this shift. But it's quite clear Gülen does now talk relatively about freedom. Now, freedom is not in his understanding of life. About that in this chapter. It's not about anything goes, because one also has a very strong sense, and I think this is not just historical, it's certainly historically in Gülen, that we go back to one of the earlier chapters where we're talking about kind of Turkey as an environment that was chaotic, and in chaos is order preferable to chaos. And a very traditional Muslim scholastic opinion would be yes. And I think Gülen shared in that, therefore at certain periods would also emphasize more that. And so that might seem counter to certain understandings of freedom. But I think where Gülen particularly uses it is in relation to people's, in this sense, theologically rooted and therefore God-given rights to believe or not to believe in what they believe or don't believe. That this is not just something important, though international human rights instruments might be in helping societies with very different sets of values, understandings, etc., at least to converse together and to maybe converge together around some standards, but that the sense of the human being and what the preciousness of the human being is in a kind of divine creation and plan, and what belongs to the human being in terms of responsibility. And of course, in that sense, freedom and love go very closely together, because one cannot love unfreely. You can't be made to love. You can be made to, or be encouraged to respect. You can be made to conform or obey, but you cannot be made to love. And I think it's this interplay between these growing hermeneutic emphases, on the one hand on the human, so one is a human before one is a Muslim, for example, in Gülen's teaching, and also that love is central to the divine vision for the human and for the world. These two things belong very deeply in terms of spirituality together. Now, what their social workings, outworkings are, and where there are limits and boundaries in terms of human behavior and social behavior and laws and norms and so on, I didn't explore to the extent that perhaps I might have done in this book. But I think part of the reason I didn't do that was because very often when those who are not Muslims engage with Muslim scholars, there's not so much explicit around freedom of conscience, religion, what we would call that in generic terms. And I think it's in many ways quite distinctive of Gülen. I was saying, some of the outworkings of that, which also I look at briefly at the end of the chapter, in terms of not supporting, quotes unquote, the theocratic vision of religion, state, and society. But it comes out of this sense, I think, in the spirituality of the interplay between freedom and love being codependent on each other in the individual towards God, and also in relation with other people.
Mhm. I mean, I know it wasn't something that you particularly looked at, but it was kind of one that I've got down, and I put thorny in brackets before when I was writing down the question.
I only saw it briefly before.
Whether
I wasn't trying to avoid it, honestly. So bring the thorny forward.
No, I mean, it's definitely a topic for itself, and I mean, it looks more at dynamics within the movement, I think, because and perhaps, as you said very early on, that it's the methodology of Hizmet that perhaps makes it distinctive in this sense. On this talk of freedom, is there perhaps a different kind of understanding of freedom for, and this would be something regarding the movement, I think more of others, so if you're living in the West, non-Muslims, and then respecting the law of the land, and is there a set of freedoms for what you as perhaps a practicing Muslims would do? And then contradictory. I mean, I put thorny in brackets because I know
it's a very interesting question, and I think a very pertinent and relevant one. It could be posed, not only to and within Hizmet. So, for example, one of the things which I guess led to parts of my particular interest in Hizmet and in Gülen is that I personally come out of a Christian tradition that has always emphasized religious freedom. Okay, and that's the Baptist Christian tradition, which more or less in most times and places has had something both to say and to do about that. But paradoxically, one might say, while the Baptist tradition has been pretty consistent in trying to preserve social space for the religious and conscience freedom of others with whom they differ very profoundly sometimes, within their own congregational life, they've not always extended that kind of sense to one another. And it's quite a paradox, because in some other traditions, for example, and to kind of use a kind of UK example, the Church of England historically as an established church made things really quite difficult throughout a lot of Christian history not just Christian history in Britain, for other Christians and for people of other faiths. Within it itself, it often has had a relatively broad spectrum, to the extent sometimes that people think, well, how can it be possible that these can coexist under the same umbrella? And often, whereas the Baptist tradition in England has sometimes become quite internally narrow and has not been prepared to work out what its affirmation of that sense, the theological rooting, the God-givenness of freedom of conscience, which they've been keen to establish and perpetrate in the wider world, what that actually means when it comes to us as a kind of religious family. So I don't know the answer to that, actually, about that. I pose it as a question, really, to Hizmet, but in Hizmet not being alone in such a thing, there is a paradox to work on, where, if it's accepted, what I'm saying also about, impulses into the wider society, how far is that? And of course, it's not a straightforward question, because inevitably, well, first of all, human beings are human beings and have their own self-interests and things, however devout they may be and however well formed they might be by spirituality or challenge. None of us are perfect, and we all have things that in interaction with others could be done much better. Above and beyond that, there are different inheritances, and we've touched on some of those by reasons of different histories, common shared experiences or not. And then there's the kind of organizational dynamics that go on in any kind of movement about which group or tendency might come into the ascendancy. What's the implication of that? Can that be held together with a respect and understanding for why others were the way they were in particular times and places, or does it have to be, are they then seen as, something passé or irrelevant? Or so, these are, I think, very challenging things. I sort of explore some of this a little bit more in the other book, Hizmet in Transitions, and also to some extent in this book later towards the end, when I'm trying to argue that the heritage that comes from Gülen is not to be looked at in terms of a pattern that's to be taken and reproduced, but is rather a set of, it's a cold word, but methodologies that are to be used. And if one can, finding ways of using those methodologies collectively is always much more challenging than finding ways of doing it individually. Just as living in families, while a great blessing, can also be a great challenge. And it's the same in religious families as well.
Yeah, and especially as the spectrum of freedoms. I mean, we just spoke about a few of consciousness, religious freedoms, but in terms of, I mean, if you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there are a lot of rights and freedoms there, and some of them are religiously contentious and cause debate.
I mean, for example, and I mean, I was just watching a little earlier here in Germany, England playing in the World Cup against Iran, and a context where, of course, the debate was going on about wearing the One Love armbands or not. And I think for all religious communities today, and I know that to be the case in for example, the Baptist Christian scene, how diversities of conscientiously held views around homosexuality can be held, and how far those then become things that are seen as decisive matters that cause a division between of often deeply held and conscientiously held views. And I know those issues are also, slowly but surely also emerging in discourse within Hizmet initiatives, as they are in all religious movements throughout the world, because that also is part of the world. And if a movement is entirely separate from the world, then maybe not. But if a movement is engaged with the world, then such questions and issues of different kinds for different generations will come to the fore.
I mean, with that, I just kind of think the Islamic kind of principle of preferring order over chaos, would that kind of be implemented internally within Hizmet? Or, I mean, there definitely are a plurality of views held by different individuals. So I guess wait for time to see how that unfolds. We have 5 minutes left and 2 kind of subsections within the chapter left. So I'm going to skip one. I'm going to skip both of them, and I'm going to ask a question related to both of them. But one is, the theocracy, democracy. I think those who have a general reading of Gülen and later the next one on terrorism have a kind of general knowledge of his opinion of those. But within that section, you talk about, in the face of terrorism, there's, liberal Islam, which has a stance. There's this modernist Islamic interpretation, which has a stance. Where does Gülen's teaching lie if you were to kind of put it in a box? I mean, I'm assuming you don't put it in either the liberal Islam or modernist Islamic as you propose those as examples. Gülen would, I guess, consider himself to be authentic, but a lot of the work that he has done has broken taboos. So it's a new way of framing what he sees as being authentic. So do you put it in a certain camp at all?
Personally, I don't like to do that. That may be partly due to a lack of sufficient knowledge of enough different tendencies and trajectories within Islam and the Muslim world, where I might be able to think, well, yes. I mean, what I was quite keen to do in that as closing sections in that sense was not to, often in Western public discourse, there's this sense that, you either have to be like us, the capital U, us, the majority us, and jettison lots of things in order, therefore, to take a clear stance in relation to terror practiced in the name of religion. And there's a confusion often between even, which I don't think Gülen is, obscurantist Islam and Islam that, Muslims that take on Islamic forms for terror. And the public discourse and politicians often slides between these things in this way, like I say, as if you have to become like us in order to be against these things. And so I'm trying to avoid that, because I think that's important to avoid, and it's important to try to show how it's possible and I make this distinction, I think, towards the end of the chapter between traditional and traditionalist. So at the top of page 148, Gülen is in many ways a traditional Muslim without being traditionalist. What he offers is an Islamic contextualization that's ethically authentic without loss of integrity in terms of its rootedness in Islam and its readiness to engage with the wider world. In this one finds a dynamic and a holistic theologizing, which can only properly be understood in relation to the formation at the nexus of interaction between Gülen's knowledge of and proficiency with Islamic sources and the context, questions and issues of social, political and religious life and times, including those engaged with by Hizmet around the world. So I'm reluctant to place Gülen in a particular categorization.
Thank you. I guess that answers the question. The reluctance. I mean, I guess with I also am reluctant too. So I share the same opinion. On that note, thank you, Paul, for being here again with us this week. We've got
more to go, I think, isn't it? Yes.
We've got a lot of kind of thank yous and people saying that the session was interesting. So I guess this was a chapter that people were interested in. So thank you and see you next week.
Thank you.